And I just wanted to comment on two diagrams of Laplanche's, one about the formation of the ego out of the body ego, and one about the drive, the differentiation of the drive from the instinct, as Laplanche rethinks this in his, as it quotes, Copernican framework. And they do bear on or have a relevance to the play, to Oedipus. Okay. We considered in the seminars what Laplanche calls the fundamental anthropological situation of the human being, the infant confronting the adult world on which it is needy and dependent. And he both picks up and develops, but also is very critical of Freud's conceptualization of that relationship, and indeed the tendency for the relation to the other to be downgraded, marginalized, or even to drop out altogether of Freud's account, as he moves from a restricted trauma-based theory of psychopathology to a general theory of sexual development. And we considered the role, we went through Laplanche's account of the role of, you see it over there, the role of the other, the adult other, and the activity of the adult other under the heading of transmission and implantation, and of the infant's receptivity and the way in which he wants to think this in relation to the question of translation. Okay. And I think we spent a lot of time on that because the kind of playing around with sort of semiotic algebra, S1s and S2s, sort of was perhaps more puzzling than helpful. But I wanted to say something about the two crucial, if you like, byproducts of that process of translation, receptivity in the first moment and translation in the second moment, because it produces the ego and the drives out of something else. So it's a formative process, a process of differentiation. And there are two diagrams, one to do with the ego and one to do with the differentiation of the ego out of the overall body, or skin ego, as Amzier calls it, and the other with the differentiation of the drive. I'll deal with the first one. Remember, there's two blobs, which is on page 135 of the chapter. There's blob number one, as it were, which he just calls the body ego. So he's taking up Freud's idea. Though I think also, though he doesn't, I'm surprised, I thought he did explicitly reference Unzier at this point. I think he does later. But it's the body ego as surface, so it's very much seen through the lens, so to speak, of Unzier's notion of the skin ego that we looked at. Okay, so the body ego, in which if you can talk about an ego at all, it is simply the receptive surfaces of the body, as Freud says. That's where our experience of boundaries and of containment and of differentiation from an inside and an outside begins in a very primitive way. And which is the receptive surface, as Amzier underlines very much, in which messages and of a very non-verbal, tactile, emotive, affective way impact on that body ego and on its periphery in particular. And it's that point where Laplanche locates his idea of the enigmatic signifier, okay, which is a pre-verbal, it may be a gesture, a tone of voice, a form of bodily contact between the nurturing adult and the dependent infant, but which carries a load of affect, a load of feeling, and which is puzzling and enigmatic, not just because the infant hasn't developed forms of understanding or decoding or translation, but because it comes from an adult who has an unconscious. And as Laplanche says in one of his sort of epigrams, that the infant that in front of the adult awakens the infant within the adult. So there's something particularly highly charged about the adult-infant relationship that allows a kind of, what he calls bungled actions, as it were, in which a conscious intention is overtaken by unconscious feelings and fantasies. Now, how do we get from that primitive state of the body ego, which is all surface, on which is implanted or impacted various things coming from the other, to the differentiation? And I have to draw it carefully because the two circles touch at a key point. Okay. The outer circle is again the whole individual. The ego is individual, the whole person, if you like, and this new formation, the ego agency. And what gets from one to the other is precisely this process of implantation in the first moment and a sort of translation. Okay. A carrying across. Freud, in that letter that I gave you, talks about a carrying across, a retranscription, when he's talking about the body ego in the chapter that we looked at from ego and the id, he talks about a mental projection inwards of the bodily surface. Okay, so the formation of a mental representation or self-image of the subject. In the letter, he talks about it in terms of a translation from which something will drop out. For every translation, there is something that remains untranslated. There's a remainder. Okay, something is too hot to handle. It can't be processed. It's too highly charged. It's too exciting or traumatizing or disturbing in some way. So, and the metaphor, one of the metaphors that Laplanche uses is that of metabolization, as when the body metabolizes food, takes in the good stuff, and expels what it doesn't want or it can't handle. So, if an act of translation produces this mental self-image based on and built up out of the various inputs that have come from the other, the enigmatic signifiers that have come from the adult, something has dropped out. Okay, there is the non-translated, the untranslated. Okay. Now he's talking here about the ego as agency, and the word that Freud uses, instans, has in German, and it has in other European languages as well, French in particular, a kind of almost legal or juridical connotation, in which the instans is somebody who stands in for, is the delegate of, is the representative of a larger whole. So the ego is a self-image that stands in for and represents the larger whole. So it has a double relationship, Laplanche comments, and he uses the two dimensions that are central to structuralist theory. Usually the terms that he used are taken from rhetoric. The ego is both a metaphor for the whole and a metonymy. Metaphor is governed by likeness. So in a sense, it's a self-representation. It's in a self-image. And it is based on the surfaces of the body and the way they're mapped. This mapping of the body gives the infant the beginnings of a sort of self-representation. And the concrete example I would use from the material we looked at is that moment I underlined in seminars from the case study of Little Hands, where the mother is carefully powdering around his genital area and taking great care not to touch it. And he notices that. He notices her not touching, as it were. And you have that kind of casual, rather charming little exchange. And he says, "Why don't you put your finger there?" And she says, "Oh, that would be schweinisch." And he just laughs and says, "Oh, but it's great fun." But in a very casual, sort of non-traumatic sort of way, a kind of zoning of his body has taken place. There's a part of his body which he thinks is great fun to touch, but which is, in the mother's word, schweinisch is very highly charged in German, much more than just saying piggish, which could just be, a childish play word or something in English. It doesn't carry the impact of disgust and repudiation that the word does have in the German. So a relation is set up between the mother and a certain part of his body, and it's under a taboo, as it were. And it's a very casual sort of exchange, okay? But it sets up something. And I think it's a useful little didactic example, in a way, of the way in which the body ego is mapped and zoned and becomes gradually a self-representation in relation to the other. Okay. So it's, in that sense, it's a metaphor, right? It's kind of based on a relationship of likeness, similarity, analogy. But it is also a part of the larger whole. It's a metonymy. It's a part that stands in for the whole. And I think I explained that in seminars in terms of the standard trope of referring to the institution of the monarchy as the crown or the throne, in which one item stands in for a larger complex. Okay, so the ego has this relationship of representation to the larger whole, of which it stands in, and it performs certain functions for that larger whole. In particular, it takes on the self-preservative or instinctual functions. Freud says, and Laplanche would very much agree with that. The ego becomes, as it were, the representative of the survival instincts, if you like, of the human subject. Though, as we saw with Freud's little metaphor of the horse and the rider, as it were, the ego's attempt to manage the whole is often capsizes or is very problematic, because the ego is not, it gradually discovers, is not master in its own house. Now, what is this other side, this stuff that doesn't get translated, that drops out? Okay. And another diagram, a very simple didactic diagram from the section on the drive, where Laplanche resituates the concept of drive in relation to his translation model. And it's a very, again, a very simple one. Yes. It's just a straight arrow and then something peeling off or like that. And this is self-preservation or the instinctual. That stuff we are born with, which is part of our species equipment, if you like. Though, as we were saying, in the human being, this is pretty weak and needs constant support from the outside, unlike other mammalian species whose instinctual functioning is more rapid and more readily stabilized and functional than ours as a species. And this is the drive, the trieb, the drive, which is essentially sexuality. Now, in Freud's account, the relationship between the two of them, he uses the metaphor of leaning on. The drive, initially in its very first moment, leans on the instinctual function, as in the oral drive, the taking in of nourishment, generates as a sort of byproduct this pleasure-seeking repetition in the absence of hunger or of need, in which the infant just goes through the pleasurable sucking processes. And it's an autoerotic moment, a moment in which the infant turns around on its own body, starts sucking its thumb or its foot or whatever else other part of it can, in order to sort of pleasure itself and to repeat a pleasure. But this repetition is functioning not at the level of need, but at the level of a pleasure-seeking repetition. Now, Freud tends to assume that this is a spontaneous process. It just is internally generated, as it were. And there are moments where he registers the possibility that that's not quite the case. I read out that passage, or I gave you that passage from the third of the three essays, where he talks about the mother and the mother's role in the awakening of the drives. But it's at a purely descriptive level. He doesn't factor it in to his theoretical model. So his model is essentially that of this spontaneous as it were, emergence of the drive as a byproduct from ordinary, everyday, instinctual functioning, in this case, the taking of nourishment, etc., in through the mouth. And Laplanche's argument is basically that this does not happen spontaneously, that the splitting off of the drive and differentiation of the drive from ordinary instinctual functioning is a result of, he doesn't put this in, but I would try and insert it visually. Can I do it? There's an intervention that takes place from the other. In fact, it's a result precisely of that implantation of the enigmatic signifier on the body's surface, that the splitting off of the drive and its pleasure-seeking and autoerotic repetition is not something that just happens spontaneously, but is a response to the enigmatic dimension of what comes from the other. Okay, that exciting, puzzling, perhaps pleasurable, perhaps too exciting and therefore unpleasurable load of affect that comes with the adult's meeting of the infant's needs. Okay, that process of implantation, he calls it, which meets the needs but deposits something else as well. Okay. So just as the differentiation of the ego as agency from the whole is a product of this implantation translation process, so also the differentiation of the drives is as well. And it's that drive, the term he uses here, he puts it SO, which stands for a source object. In other words, an object that has come in from the outside, prototypically in the didactic example that is standardly used, the mother's giving of her breast for nurturing the child. This object that comes from the other, from the outside, is then leaves a deposit. What is untranslatable. The non-translatable remainder of that act of giving, the mother giving of her body to the infant in order to suckle it. Something drops out, remains untranslated, and that becomes a source. The source of what? The source of the drive. Okay, it stimulates, it provokes this autoerotic pleasure-seeking repetition on the part of the infant. So he's taken these two terms from Freud's theory of source and object, and source and object remain on two sides of a border. The source is internal and bodily in Freud. The object is what comes along and satisfies that and relieves that internal tension. In Laplanche, the object is a signifying object as well as a need-meeting object, and it's subjected to translation, incorporation, and something that remains untranslated, something that is repressed, because it's too, as I've said, too hot to handle, as it were. And that becomes the source of the drives. The drives don't just well up out of the body's functioning. The drives are the byproduct of this exchange between adult and infant. Okay, so it's a resituating of the concept of the drive in terms of this intersubjective field between adult and infant, and the way in which the adult and the adult's feelings and unconscious impacts in a quite direct, exciting, primitive way on the body surface of the infant. Now, I'm going to use that. So that's, maybe I'll pause for a brief second and just, are there any questions people want to ask about what I'm saying here, or what my exposition of what I think Laplanche is saying here? Particularly anybody who, and apologies again, who prepared a little intro to those sections and we didn't get round to it in the seminar. If you want to pose any queries or puzzles about what is being said here, what are the implications of being said here, then now's your moment to do so. It is complicated. You need to get your head around the way certain concepts function like this in Freud's theory and are repositioned and function differently in Laplanche's theory. Okay. But it's worth making the effort, I'm suggesting. So any puzzles or questions or confusions that people want to voice, or comments? Silence. I've managed to silence you, have I? Now, who was going to do the introductions? Jess and Alice. Do you have anything you want to, puzzles you want to raise, or questions you want to raise from? Well, okay, let me try and use this as a transition to saying something about Oedipus. You may recall I gave you that Blake poem, and I read it out in the lecture on Laplanche's theory. It's a very powerful, but itself very puzzling symbolic allegory, The Mental Traveller, which begins with the birth of the child. If the child is born a boy, he's given to a woman old. She nails him down upon a rock and catches his shrieks in cups of gold. And a whole cycle is followed through. He turns into a bleeding youth. She turns into a maiden or a virgin bright. He binds her down in a repetition of the way in which he has been bound down. And the poem traces this cycle through a whole allegorical series of transformations until it comes full circle and it ends restating that same situation. Now, you've got there an image of the impact, and a rather violent one. It's elaborated in a later stanza as she implants herself in all his nerves. Okay, Blake says. So we've got there a powerful and indeed an extreme image of the adult's impact on, indeed he uses the same metaphor, I think, of implanting that Laplanche does in the infant and the infant's body. And we've got our example from Little Hands of the mother trying not to be intrusive, invasive, possessive, as it were, but nevertheless, as it were, marking the child's body and her very abstention, okay, she thinks, from intruding on what might be a sensitive part of his body. Now, there's also an image in Sophocles' play Oedipus that one could put with those two images. Now, Sophocles is really not interested in child psychology. Okay, we don't get an account of baby Oedipus, or his growing up, or how he felt about Merope, whom he thought was his mother in Corinth, or how he felt about Polybus, who he thought was his father over there in Corinth, as it were. Sophocles has no interest at that level in child psychology. Okay, so in a way, the play does not invite us to do a kind of standard psychologizing reading of Oedipus exactly in the way that we might be familiar with, or the way in which some commentators might have tried to do, or complained about the absence of. But there is a very, very powerful image in the play of the infant newborn Oedipus and what happens to him, or what is done to him. Okay, and it's produced first of all in a very, very casual way in that long speech of Jocastas that I've asked people to sort of focus on as the first of three speeches in the play. And remember, she comes on stage. There's been a huge row between Oedipus and Creon. She's very distressed that they're at loggerheads, and Oedipus is kind of threatening to have him executed. And she tries to sort of calm things down. And he says, he accused me. He wound up, or he used the prophet Tiresias, who then accused me of being the murderer of the previous king Laius, and he's very upset and worried himself about it. And she says, no, he was killed by a band of robbers, at a place where three roads cross. It's got nothing to do with you. It couldn't have been you. It was, the report back of what happened was there was this band of robbers who attacked him in his train, and only one person survived to bring back the story of what happened. And it took place at a place where three roads cross. And of course, Oedipus is kind of stunned by this. And what he's stunned by is that very, very bare but very suggestive description of where it took place. The place where three roads cross. That phrase is repeated a number of times in the play, and it marks out the place in a very specific way. There's a scene, something takes place there at that scene, and he revisits that, and the play revisits what exactly took place at that scene again and again and again. Now remember, initially, he's not thinking about the oracle that he received from Apollo's shrine at Delphos. He's thinking about rather the second message he's got in response to the fever and the plague that struck Thebes, in which he, as a good and conscientious king, is sent to Apollo's oracle to say, what do I do about this? Please give me some help. And the message comes back is the regicide who killed the previous king is living among you, and that is a pollution that is contaminating the whole city and blighting the fertility of its women and of its fields, and etc. And so you must seek out this regicide and expose him and punish him if you want to cleanse the city of its pollution, because you are under a curse. And so he thinks of himself as looking for a regicide. He's not thinking about the prophecy that he'd personally received about that made him flee from Corinth and avoid his home city. So she just says, a place where three roads cross, and it really hits him. But the very next sentence, the next line of verse, is she says, and the child that was supposed to, the whole point she's making is that he was killed by a band of robbers, yet we had this oracle, that was given us by the priests at Delphos that said that, we would have a son and he would murder his father. Interestingly, incest isn't mentioned by her. It's simply the patricide, the killing of the father figure. But we cast the child out, and his feet were bound together, and he was cast out to die on a mountain. And she just passes on. Right? So it's just casually produced, but it's immediately produced in relationship to and adjacent to her description of the place where three roads cross, and where the group of robbers are supposed to have killed Laius. Okay, so it's quite a startling juxtaposition in Jocastas' speech. So the infant's body, the piercing of the feet, the binding of them together, and they're given to a shepherd to cast him out and expose him on a mountain. And this was kind of, in a way, standard practice in the classical world. I mean, I don't think so much maybe the binding of the feet. I think that's very particular to Sophocles' account. But the exposure of children, the exposure of unwanted children, either because they were just too many and the parents couldn't afford to bring them up, or because in some ways they were cursed or they were under they were felt to be under some sort of divine sentence of some kind. And there were places where you left them, and what very often the hope was that some charitable person would come along and find them and look after them, etc. So child exposure as a practice was, not uncommon in the classical world. The piercing of the feet, I think, is quite specific to Sophocles. Okay, and he uses the word arthra, meaning joints, and where we get our word arthritis from. Okay, and that word is again, Gould's commentary is absolutely invaluable here. He picks up on, tells the English reader who doesn't have Greek, the points at which this word is repeated in the play. So there's this double piercing, the piercing of the arthra of the infant's feet, and his abandonment, his rejection, his casting out by his parents. This is then repeated later on in the play, where Oedipus is pursuing his investigation into what happened to Laios, and he wants to find out, is it true? Was it done by a band of robbers? And we're told there's an old servant, the one survivor, and he's gone off and he's up in the hills somewhere looking after, tending a flock of sheep on Mount Catharon. So he's sent for, and I think Jocasta is ahead of Oedipus on this one. She sees what's coming, and she tries to persuade him, look, forget it, just drop it, don't keep asking questions, it doesn't matter. And he just thinks, oh, you're being snobbish, you think I'm going to turn out to have been, not from a princely house, okay. And this is a response to the arrival of the messenger from Corinth to say, your father's dead. And she says, see, oracles, schmoracles, who cares? They often turn out not to be true. Don't get hot and bothered about the whole thing. But at a certain point, when he starts saying, oh, well, actually, you don't need to be bothered because actually you weren't his son. In fact, you were given to me by a shepherd that I used to sort of spend time with. He came from Thebes and I came from Corinth, and we used to, shepherd our flocks in the same mountains. So don't worry. You're not going to. You didn't kill Polybus, and he wasn't your dad anyway. And Merope isn't your mother. And at that point, Jocasta, I think, knows. Oh my God, she can see what's coming, and she tries to persuade him to drop the whole thing. He won't, and she exits in a state, saying, "This is the last thing I'll say to you, a miserable man. You're cursed by the gods," or whatever. She goes off, and as we later find out, to commit suicide. And he's still persisting, trying to find out what happened. And the messenger says, yes, I found you, your feet were pierced and tied together. And again, he says the same word, arthra. And he says, that's how you got your name. That's how you got your name. You were named after that, and in the Greek, as I said in my email to you, Oedipus's name breaks down into 2 syllables. Oedipus. Now that first part of his name, he has already invoked and punned on himself when he's having his argument with the prophet Tiresias. And Tiresias is refusing to say anything, and Oedipus is understandably angry. You mean you know who killed Laios and you won't tell us? How can you betray the city like this? And he rages at Tiresias. And finally Tiresias says, actually, you're the killer, under enormous pressure and anger from Oedipus. and Oedipus dismisses him. He says, "Oh, how could I at all trust or believe in your powers of prophecy? You know, after all, you failed to do anything when the Sphinx was here, when the Sphinx was posing her riddle. You couldn't solve it. All with your divinations, you're looking at the entrails of birds and your supposed power of prophecy. You couldn't solve the riddle of the Sphinx and defeat the Sphinx. I did it, me." And he comes out with a line of Greek verse, "Ho maiden," I think it's A-N. Eidos Oedipus, which literally means nothing knowing, no foot. Okay, so by doubling the word Oedipus with eidos, meaning no, you know, I who know nothing, ignorant old me, you know, and it's obviously he's being ironic here. I solved the problem with my intelligence, with my nomos, the use of my human faculty, with your use of your supposedly divine powers, divinely given powers of prophecy. You couldn't do it. I did it, using my nous, my intelligence, my shrewdness. So me, nothing knowing, no foot. And of course, in punning, actually he plays on both halves of his name. Oide meaning from the verb to know, and pus meaning foot. Okay, and of course the feet was what the riddle was about. The Sphinx was posing this enigma to whoever tried to come in or out of the city, and if they couldn't answer the riddle, she killed them. And the riddle was, what is that creature which walks in the morning on 4 feet, at noonday walks on 2 feet, and in the evening walks on 3 feet, and is feeblest when it walks on most feet? Is at its weakest when it walks on 4 feet, or on most feet. And what rhymes there again and again is tetrapus, meaning 4 foot, dipus, meaning 2 foot, tripus, meaning 3 foot, Oedipus. And so Oedipus is alluding to the riddle that he solved, okay, by calling himself, in effect, no foot, the one who knew about feet. Okay. And it's I think presented by Sophocles and traditionally, and I think quite plausibly interpreted as an act of hubris and of an assertion of a kind of like a humanist rationality that is meant to, by Sophocles, to in some ways represent the whole culture of the Athenian Enlightenment, which was, and particularly the whole tradition of philosophy, which was calling into question and interrogating critically the myths of the gods, about the gods, and claiming powers and privileges for the use of human reason. So, and I think it was Hegel called Oedipus the first philosopher, and in that tradition of German continental philosophy, Oedipus is seen as a kind of as a allegorical representative of the use of philosophical reason. So a moment of pride on Oedipus's part. Little old me, little old know nothing, no foot. I solved the riddle. You were hopeless. So he's dismissing Tiresias and his divinely sanctioned insight or knowledge, as it were. But of course, that, if we hadn't already picked it up, and of course you have to remember that this is not a whodunit. The Greek audience knew the story. They all knew what was to come. And so what they're listening for is how that fate is to kind of be played out on the tragic stage. So they can hear and perhaps anticipate the pun, which is not that on knowledge, okay, but it's a pun on another Greek verb. I think it's spelled with a double E, to swell. And that's what the messenger does. The messenger comes and turns around the meaning of Oedipus's name by saying, that's why you were called, that's why you were given your name. That names you who you are, he says. Oidein, swellfoot. or the swollen-footed one. Okay. And indeed, Greek commentators have often said that the whole family line of which Laios goes back to an ancestor called Labdacus, who was a limping figure. So limping and swollen-footed and people who are maimed at the foot, there is this ancestral connection there, which again a Greek audience would have been aware of. So he thinks of himself as no-foot, and what the Messenger of Corinth says, you're actually swell-foot. But don't worry, your father's dead, so you're not going to commit patricide, and you needn't be worried anyway because he wasn't really your father. But he deposits this bombshell. Okay, that the maiming of the infant's feet has given him his name, and in a sense his identity. He is named. That names you who you are. The Corinthian messenger says. So we have this sense of this Oedipus's body as being on the receiving end of a kind of violence that has come from the outside, whether it's the infant Oedipus, whether it's at different moments, this act of violence is repeated in different contexts. His encounter with this old man in a chariot who tries to push him out of the way at the place where three roads cross, or again, what he then does in full knowledge and full consciousness to himself when he's discovered who and what he is, okay, where he puts out his eyes. And again, very usefully, Gould comments on the fact that Sophocles uses the same word, arthra, in a very unique way in Greek to refer not to the joints of the feet but to the eyes, the arthra of his eyes, and people puzzle over it. Could this be, a scribal error or something? But as he says, this double blinding relates back to a series of double acts of violence done to Oedipus's body in the course of the play, or in the course of his life, which is relived in the play. So a kind of violent marking, a traumatic wounding, double wounding of the tragic protagonist's body is something that the play keeps focusing us on. Now, I want to say something at this point about Freud's reading of the tragedy, and the moment in the development of his thought where he turns to Sophocles and Shakespeare's Hamlet, and he thinks of them together. They're twinned in his mind, Hamlet and Oedipus. And in all the excerpts I've given you, he no sooner mentions Oedipus than Hamlet will come up as well. And he sketches out a kind of a reading of both plays in the letter to Fleece, and then he elaborates that and rewrites that in that section from chapter 5, I think it is, on typical dreams, from the interpretation of dreams, where he gives them a fuller account. But I mean, he's not writing a literary critical essay. He's thinking about two tragedies in order, in some ways, to help himself think through a moment of theoretical crisis or blockage in his own thought. And where he first does this, or where we have a first evidence of it, is within 3 weeks. It is the letter to Fleece about Oedipus and Hamlet is in October the 15th, I think, 1897, 3 weeks after a previous letter, which we also looked at, where he says, I don't think I believe my theory of traumatic seduction anymore, because there are all these problems that I can't solve in relation to the theory. So in the wake of his, and it is only a temporary one because he oscillates back and forwards, but in the wake of his first and partial or temporary abandonment, rather, of his theory of traumatic seduction, he turns to these two plays, and he becomes really intensely preoccupied with these two tragedies. And he's clearly thinking, as it were, you could say partly thinking outside the box, or trying to think outside the framework of his theory, using literature to do that. And he does that on a number of occasions in which, in a moment of theoretical crisis, he turns to aesthetic questions, or to a literary texts that preoccupy him, as it were. We'll see another example of this next term, towards the end of next term in 1919, where Freud is reformulating his drive theory and bringing on stage for the first time the notion of the death drive. And he takes time off to write an essay on the uncanny, and the aesthetics of the uncanny, and he produces a reading of a great 19th century German romantic writer, E.T.A. Hoffmann, a reading of his novella The Sandman. We've already looked at one of Hoffmann's novellas, but Freud gives a kind of a reading of that. And it's a fascinating sort of double moment, 1897, 1919, where at moments of theoretical crisis, Freud turns to literature and starts thinking about literature. As a way, partly as a way through the crisis. He does something similar with a text we'll be looking at next term, again in relation to the question of seduction, where he writes his fascinating case study of Leonardo da Vinci, and he does a reading of some of Leonardo's paintings, and we'll be looking at that next term as well. So certain moments, art or literature become crucial in Freud's thinking. It's as if it becomes internal to the development of his theory. Now, in both the case of the two tragedies that we're looking at this week and next week, and of Hoffmann's text we'll be looking at next term, Freud chooses texts, or he seems drawn to, magnetized by texts that have a traumatic structure to them, which seem to be organized around sort of a process of traumatic repetition in which a scene of trauma is reframed, resignified, translated, if you like, in a kind of almost compulsive way. He's drawn to texts that have that traumatic structure, and he then gives an Oedipal reading of them, okay, both of the two tragedies and of Hoffmann's novella. Now, I want to situate the readings he gives of the tragedies in relation to this first turning point in his thought, and in particular to the way in which Laplanche had both redescribed it and criticized it. That is to say, in terms of Laplanche's distinction, or actually Freud's distinction, which Laplanche takes up, between the Copernican and the Ptolemaic, between a conceptual model that is centered on the other, just as in cosmology, the Earth isn't the center around which the universe moves, but is itself merely a dependent planet that circles around the sun in a localized solar system, and a Ptolemaic model which had dominated both European and Middle Eastern culture for hundreds and hundreds of years, where the Earth is the center of the universe and everything else moves around the Earth. And Freud had set up himself and psychoanalysis in relationship to what he sees as the three blows to human narcissism and self-centering that science had given to challenged human narcissism. Now, Laplanche takes that up and kind of partly twists it around and reapplies it back to Freud, as we saw. And he makes the very, I think, telling suggestion that if Freud is his own Copernicus, he is also his own Ptolemy. In other words, within the field of psychoanalysis, these two contradictory logics of decentering and recentering play themselves out in different texts, sometimes even in the same text of Freud's. Now, this is the moment where Freud moves from his model of traumatic seduction to the beginnings. It's just the seed, the beginnings of his developmentalist model of sexuality in general. And he says, in a suggestive phrase to Fleece in the letter, he wants to posit a universal event in childhood, the falling in love with the mother, the rivalry with the father, that configuration, which he finds in his, again and again, his clinical material and in his own personal self-analysis. And he wants to think about that, and he immediately moves on to thinking about, that's why we find Oedipus Rex so compelling a tragedy. And then he goes on to think about Hamlet as well, the puzzle of Hamlet and Hamlet's paralysis and Hamlet's delay. So his interpretation of the tragedies replicates that logic of, as it were, recentering that is in the process of taking place in his theory. And he says of the tragedy, he says, it's often thought of as a tragedy of fate, and that's the form it's taken, where the action of the gods determines the protagonist's destiny. He says, but that's not why it's so powerful. That's not why it continues to haunt modern people who don't believe in the gods, okay? And attempts to imitate Greek tragedy just haven't worked. He says what gives it its power is not the role of the gods and of the oracle and the divine or demonic determination of human life, but the material in which it's played out, the material of patricide and incest. Because everybody in the audience was once a budding Oedipus, and this play awakens all that material again, and we find it kind of disturbing or compelling or whatever. And he simply sees the role of the oracle and of Apollo as being, he says, the externalization of an inner necessity. Okay, it's simply a way of projecting outwards what is this inner compulsion, which impulses that are imposed on us by nature, he says. Which are unavoidable and universal. Okay. So the external agencies in the play are simply projections outwards of these Oedipus's inner impulses. And it's Oedipus's inner impulses that, as it were, drive the action or drive the play. And a standard objection people have made to Freud's reading is, well, hang on a minute. Oedipus is given this warning by the oracle, and he does his best to avoid it. Instead of he comes from Corinth to Delphos to say, somebody told me that I'm not really the child of my parents. Please, Apollo, will you confirm or not this story? And he says, Apollo dishonored me. He didn't tell me. He didn't answer my question, but he gave me something else instead. He gave me this appalling prophecy that I was fated to kill my father and marry my mother. And so he avoids Corinth. He immediately sort of heads in the opposite direction. And what is the first thing that happens to him is he encounters this man in a chariot at a place where 3 roads cross, who tries to push him out of the way, and who strikes him down, and he strikes back and kills the man. So in rebound from the prophecy, doing his best to avoid it, he ends up enacting it. Okay, and if you think about the parents as well, the same thing has happened with them. Right? They got this terrible prophecy, and the first thing they did as soon as the child was born, it was a boy, they pierced its feet and cast it out in an attempt to avoid these sacrilegious and polluting acts that would have been the consequences of the child growing up, etc. And it's that very act that, as it were, makes Oedipus ignorant of who his parents are. And so people say, well, hang on, he couldn't have been acting on his Oedipus complex, his so-called Oedipus complex, in that case. Okay. And Freud's response is to say, Oedipus's ignorance of what he's done and who he is simply the representation of the unconscious nature of these impulses. Okay. Oedipus's ignorance of what he's done and who his parents are is a representation of the unconscious nature of these impulses. So what Freud has done, in effect, at the level of his interpretation of Greek and also Shakespearean tragedy, is to center the tragic protagonist on his own impulses. It's the impulses of Oedipus, which have been acted out, or in Hamlet's case, haven't been acted out, but have been repressed, that, as it were, drive and therefore explain the tragic action. And the rest is just, a sort of allegorization or projection of those inner impulses. So in effect, he's collapsed an external agency into Oedipus's own inner impulses. He's, in a sense, made a Ptolemaic interpretation, to use those two terms, a Ptolemaic interpretation which excludes or forecloses or marginalizes the relationship to the other. And the other, in this case, is figured by this repeated word in the play that Gould draws our attention to, the daemon. At key moments when Oedipus does things, we're told, a daemon lunged or a daemon showed the way. Okay, so Oedipus does things, they're his actions, but in performing those actions, some other force is at work. Okay, a force that comes to him from the outside and from the other. So that Freud's reading, while it acknowledges and sees a pattern in both plays, makes sense of it by centering it back on the tragic protagonist, instead of seeing how the tragic protagonist is himself decentered by his relationship to these daemonic, or in Hamlet's case, spectral figures, ghostly figure of the father, that hound him down or that haunt him in various ways in the two tragedies. So that would, using Laplanche's 180-degree spin on the Copernican Ptolemaic terminology, it would raise the question, which at a theoretical level Laplanche's work always raises, is where is the other in this? Okay, how do these concepts of repression, sublimation, ego formation, the drive, how are they related to the intervention of the other? Position them in relation to the other. In other words, his work insists on the Copernican dimension at the level of theory, and I think it gives us a prompt to ask the Copernican question in relationship to the interpretation of these two tragedies. Okay, Freud points to a triangular pattern and centers it on the tragic protagonist, but we need to think about how is the tragic protagonist decentered, okay, in the process of the action of the two tragedies. Okay, so in a way it's the Copernican question at the level of literary interpretation. So Laplanche's theoretical development, I think, helps us to try and recapture a certain dimension of the two tragedies that Freud's reading tends to sideline or to marginalize. Okay, let's stop there for the time being.